Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Coalesce. My name is Erin Vaughn, and I'm the Director of Customer Success at DBT Labs. I am absolutely thrilled to be hosting today's session. This is just the beginning, presented by Alan Cruickshank. A spicy title for what I assure you will be an exciting 30 minutes. Alan leads data at Tails.com. Tails provides subscription tailor-made pet food in the UK. Alan's also the author and maintainer of SQL Fluff. If Alan looks familiar to those of you who have been in the DBT community for a bit, you have fantastic memories. Alan is not new to the Coalesce stage and spoke last year about SQL Fluff. So before we jump into things, some quick reminders. All chat conversation is taking place in the Coalesce Just the Beginning channel of DBT Slack. If you want to join, you can click the button on your screen. I highly recommend it. If you've enjoyed the presentations so far this week, I can assure you that seeing dozens of folks in the community live reacting, memeing, and asking questions throughout the presentation really puts a cherry on top of the true Coalesce experience. To kick us off, because Tails is a company focused on pets, we want to hear about and see yours. So our chat champion has started a thread to have you introduce yourself, let us know where you're calling in from, and share a picture of your fur baby and what their name is. If you are more of a pet rock person, let us know what you would name a hypothetical pet. Once the presentation wraps up, Alan will stick around to answer questions in the Slack channel. So let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everybody. I'm Alan. I look after data at Tails.com, and Erin said I'm looking forward to seeing pictures of pets in the Slack channel. So this is all just a ruse to collect pictures of your animals. Just kidding. Anyway, so the title of today's talk is somewhat intentionally provocative, but let me do a little bit of context before we get into that. I'm Alan. I look after data at Tails.com, and as Erin said, I'm the author and one of the maintainers of SQL Fluff. I think some of the SQL Fluff crew are probably in the chat today. There are also a couple of Tails.com people in the chat today. Feel free to tag them. Guys, if you're around, say hi. Otherwise, but I'm not going to talk about either of those two specifically today, although they will come up a little bit later on. So before we get started, I'd like everyone who's here today to take a couple of minutes couple of seconds to think about what your vision is for data, whether that's for your immediate data team or for data at your organization or for your DBT project. Just picture what it is. And if you're feeling keen, drop it into the Slack thread. We'll come back to this in a second. Okay, clear in your head? So if we think about how we've got to where we've come to, and this is going to seem a little bit roundabout, but this will make sense in a second. We've come a long way in analytics, even just over the course of the last year, from the things that were going on at Coalesce 2020. Even within relatively recent memory, we were on the left-hand side of this diagram. We were in Excel 95. We had Clippy helping us make spreadsheets, and all was good. Now, from there, we've progressed a few. We've gone into ad hoc SQL and started to try and interact with different granularity data sets ourselves. We started using tools. We started using tools like Git or Airflow to version control our code, to schedule things so that we don't have to click buttons all the time. We've started to move into the world of DBT or other alternatives to DBT, LookML, to define our business logic and define things in tools so that we can start to reuse things and not write the same thing over and over again. We then moved into DBT macros, into packages, and to really develop the craft skill that is analytics and analytics engineering. And if we look at some of the more recent things that are happening right now, we mentioned SQL Fluff, getting into linting and making sure that the quality of our code is good. We're getting into tools like Materialize, where we're starting to see the line between batch and stream processing being blurred a little bit more. And we're getting into seeing tools like Select Star, who are trying to map lineage between different places. And I think that leads us to an interesting place now for what teams are working on. And what I've primarily discussed here is the tooling, but I think there's a reason that the tooling has changed so much. And that's because the things we're trying to communicate as a community are getting more complicated. This is, for some of you, the very familiar DICWA pyramid: data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And I bring it up not because of what it's primarily used for, but because of its relevance for what it means for the data that we're building on, and why lineage and metadata has got more important within that. So at the bottom of the pyramid, if you're communicating just data, you don't need to know where the data come from. Data is data. It doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't matter whether it's good data or bad data. If that's what you're communicating, it's just data. In some ways, information requires a little bit of knowledge of lineage, but you don't need to make sure it's trustworthy in any way. In some ways, fake news is information. It's not necessarily valid information, but it's still information. But once we start getting into knowledge and wisdom specifically, but knowledge, you need to know something about your lineage. It's not knowledge if you don't have a reason to believe it to be true. And if you can't believe it to be true without having some reason to believe that the source is valid. And doubly so when we get to wisdom, it almost takes into account that lineage and quality as a necessary part of the knowledge itself. In some ways, wisdom is knowing the difference between trustworthy data and untrustworthy data and being able to make differentiations between those two and sensible assertions of it. With those two things in mind, so the progression of the tooling that we've talked about, the progression of the insight and the things we're trying to communicate, if I listen to data teams that I talk to in the community, primarily I hear people talking about three things at the moment. Some people are focusing on reusability. I touched on DBT packages, and there are other places that reusability is going on. What do I standardize? What do I customize? And how do I do that effectively for my team? We hear people talking about metadata, the data of data, and how to treat that data potentially some ways the same way, potentially differently to other data that's going on. And the last thing that I think is interesting right now is latency. So going beyond the daily batch process to refresh your entire DBT DAG or to refresh your entire platform on a daily basis. Can we do better than that? Can we get better latency? Granted, this is probably a biased sample set. There may be other interesting things going on there. There's probably a shout out to governance and data quality on here too. But for now, I'm going to assume that these are the three things that are going on at the moment. So looking at reusability first, what I think is interesting at the moment is how we're seeing areas of our stack standardize and areas of our stack differentiate. So if I talk you through the diagram I've got on screen at the moment, on the left, we generate data to do analytics on. That might be on a pencil and paper in an industrial environment. That might be within an app or a website in an e-commerce environment. That might be within a call center or within some other mixture of physical and digital experience somewhere else. We then ingest, we inquire, we get the data, we bring it to somewhere that we can use it. We then store it, normalize it, make it usable for analysis. We then combine and join that data together with data from other sources. We analyze it to extract the information, and then we visualize and deploy that out to the people using the data. And if we look at the last 5 years, maybe 3 years, certainly the ingesting and acquisition of data has become continually standardized. The adage of don't ask your engineers to write ETL has hit home successfully. Tools like Fivetran, Stitch, Meltano, PipelineWise, a whole wealth of tools in the ingestion and acquisition space are standardizing what it means to bring data into one place. Storage and normalization is becoming standardized as a grow out from that space. The way that we store data is certainly standardized. I don't think it would be controversial to say that of all of the people on the call today, the number of data warehouses represented is probably less than the number I can count on one hand. And the way that we normalize data within that is slowly becoming more standardized as well. Look at the work that Fivetran are doing with DBT packages. Look at the work that other people are doing across the DBT community to bring packages in to normalize data from different sources into a standardized format. I realize I skipped. Instrumentation has had less standardization at this end, but is slowly starting to standardize the way that we collect and instrument data, mostly in the web space. So if you think about web event collection, that is slowly being standardized with tools like analytics.js. But there are other things happening in the instrumentation space to slowly standardize the way that the data is created. If I go to the opposite end of this diagram and the way that data is being used, certainly the way that data is being visualized is, if at the very least, becoming more professionalized. I think it's also becoming more standardized. Gone are the days when a business has to invent how to make a churn curve. People know what a churn curve looks like. There is a standard way of doing it that has been well established now. Bar charts, line graphs, the ability of analytical professionals to know how to make one, when to use one, is becoming more standardized. Potentially a more controversial thing to say at the visualize and deploy end of the spectrum is around data science. Have a reflect on how many truly novel data science use cases you've seen in the last couple of years. I would go as far as saying the core group, and of course there are interesting things happening at the tail end, but for the vast majority of businesses, we're talking about churn prediction, we're talking about recommendation and product recommendations. We're talking about basket analysis. We're talking about to do in what circumstance. But the number of use cases is becoming consolidated for most businesses to be a standard set of things you're going to do. And what I think that means for us as an analytics community is the place where we add our secret sauce, where you add your business logic, is getting squeezed into this bit in the middle, into how you combine data sources cleverly and how you analyze data sources cleverly. And both of those two things, thankfully for the context of the conference we're at the moment, at least for our team, and I think for many people here, happen within DBT. And this is where a lot of the secret source of what your data organization is doing is happening. And the rest of the stack is becoming standardized. This leads nicely onto metadata. And I realize this is quite a wordy slide, but let me talk you through from left to right on what is going around on metadata. So all of us will know that bad data is worse than no data. I would much rather have a graph that said, this is up to date as of yesterday, than it to show today's data wrong. And that's because all of us operate on trust. We have trust with the people who use our data, that we must have trust in the data that we use. And we know that it only takes a few incidents or issues of that data quality to erode that goodwill, erode that trust, and drastically slow down the use of data in decision-making. So what does bad data mean in that context? The very top end and how people are using data, that means assured metrics that you know are correct. And in short, that could just be because they're correct today, because we know that if we work them out for yesterday, they are what yesterday was yesterday. On a grander scale, or at least for our team at the moment, that might mean taking our key metrics and making sure that when we recalculate them for a year ago, that they are exactly the number that we had a year ago. And that can give us confidence that they are what they are today. Just having assured metrics on the top end only gets you so far, though. We need to know known and consistent latency. Teams need to, and I say here, real time never exists. Anyone who says they has real-time metrics doesn't have real-time metrics. The question is your latency in seconds, milliseconds, nanoseconds, minutes, hours, or days. And for some teams, days is fine. For some teams, weeks is fine. For some teams, they need seconds. But they need to know whether it's seconds or whether it's days, and it needs to be consistent. And lastly, the inputs need to be quality. You can, if your outputs start failing, or you're starting to use outputs which aren't in that core set of things you test, you need to have quality inputs. And there are, I'm not going to go into it today, but there are a whole host of tools which are becoming standardized in that space. And lastly, around latency. I think certainly for us, and I think for several other DBT projects that I'm familiar with, the standard has been a monolithic project with monolithic latency. And what we're starting to see more and more, not just at Tails.com, but I think, I'm going to forget the name of who it was last, JetBlue last year, talking about how they've been working on granular latency for their project, and how you can have a monolithic project with different latencies within the different streams of their project. And we can do better than just marching to the slowest drum, but we have to do it intelligently. All of your data faster doesn't necessarily make sense. You need to work out which bits make sense to go faster, and which bits actually either you don't want to pay the computational expense to make them go faster, or actually the teams that are going to use it, they don't need it to be any faster. Daily is absolutely fine for that. So we've just gone through, in a little bit of a whirlwind way, 3 major themes that I think cover a lot of people's goals for data right now. We've covered reusability, customization, and standardization. We've covered metadata, and within that, lineage and data quality, on how much you can assure the quality of your input and output data. And lastly, we talk about latency, how we can be more intelligent about latency and get from just monolithic daily dumps of data through to different speeds and maybe even blending in some streaming into that. Have a reflect. How close do these sit to some of the goals that you wrote down at the beginning of this session? And how bold do those goals feel given what we've covered so far? And this is potentially the spoilers part of it. So I think all of the things we've talked about now are all achievable today at all shapes and sizes of organizations. Now, the speed that you can do that will depend on the size and shape of your organization, but all of this is very achievable and potentially faster than you thought. Not only have we got standardized approaches for some of this stuff, but we have standardized tool sets that are appearing for this, and a wide range of people within the community, some of whom are here today, some of whom you've come across in the rest of the community, who can help you do this and have ideas on how to do this. And in some ways, this is great. This is a sign that we as a community have done exactly what we set out to do over the last couple of years. But I think the challenge here is, well, if this is what we think our goals are and it's all very achievable, what does that mean we should be aiming for? And is that bold enough for the next year, for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years of what we as a community should be trying to do? There's a caveat here. Everything up to this point, I think, is applicable to everyone. It doesn't matter what organization you're from. It doesn't matter what stage of your journey you're at, whether you're just starting to get into this, whether you feel like you're in the middle, or whether you feel like you're very mature. I think it applies to everyone. What follows here is how I think we've applied this thinking at Tails.com and how we see the next wave of progress. Results may vary. How you apply this in your organization may be different. But I'd like to sketch out how it looks for us in a hope of trying to map that onto your organization in future. So if you picture the spectrum of data users in your organization, at one end you have what you would probably call either your analytics team or your data team, or the data people who are using data a lot and they find data very useful. And if you think about the opposite end of the spectrum of your organization, I'm going to pick our office dogs. Now, I'm sure whichever organization you work for, there are people or other animals in your organization who are very not data. They're not using data right now. And if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, data isn't particularly useful to them. And there is a big spectrum of people in the middle whose hypothetical usefulness of data varies, let's say for the purpose of today, linearly. It might not be linear, but there's some relationship between how data-y they are and how much that data is useful for them. Consider, before I do the next animation, how the actual usage of data varies across the spectrum right now. Is it also linear? Does it follow the same relationship? Is it above this line? Is it below this line? I would posit that for some organizations, us included, the actual usage of data looks a lot like this. You have a core group of people who are using data. They're using visualization, they're using raw data, they're using DBT, they're using all of these tools a lot, and they find data very useful. But as soon as you step out of that group, the usage of data drops off quite dramatically, and the actual usefulness of data to that next layer out of people hasn't changed a lot. There's a group of people who could get a lot of value out of data if they were using it more, but aren't using it very much. And then that stays consistent, or maybe drops off a little bit more out to the edges. I'm going to bring up a term which I feel like some other people this week have started to try and reclaim, but I'm going to jump on that bandwagon again. The word self-serve. Now, I think a few years ago, if someone said self-serve, what they intended to do was this red line. They wanted to get everyone in the organization using all of the data all of the time. And if you look at, that's a big delta from where we are today. That involves upscaling a huge group of people to use data a lot more. And that's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of time, and it may not be very successful, and you might not see a lot of results very early. What I think DBT enables is for us to much more accurately map the actual data usage to the hypothetical usefulness without a load of extra effort. There are people in the fringes of your data-ness whether they're your office pets, who don't need to use data a lot. But for these people who are closer to your data team, I think the next wave of what we need to do is enable them not to look within at our own teams and help and build out the tooling and approaches more. And that is useful. But I think we need to start looking out to start enabling the people around us in our organization and to use DBT as a tool to do that so that we can get all of the people around us that we work with closer to that hypothetical usefulness of data. And I think this has a nice parallel in that I feel like as a community over the last few years, we've been progressively reclaiming the word analyst to be a meaningful role with an organization and not just if I think 5 years ago, where the word analyst might have been a slightly derogatory term for an entry level employee in a large accounting firm, whereas now it means something again. And I think while we've tried this a couple of times, I think it's now time for us to go out and reclaim self-serve. The intent of what self-serve was good. We wanted people who may not consider themselves to be data professionals in essence to be able to do more with data themselves. And that relies on having good tooling. Now, what we've done in this focus of focusing back on the analyst is to build out that tooling, to build out the approaches, to build out the frameworks that allow us as data teams to be effective and to be successful. And we've got quite automated at that, and we've managed to standardize a good chunk of it. And I think that standardization that we've reclaimed over the last few years will now be the bedrock that allows this next wave of self-serve to work and for us to empower the people around us. Because really, that's what our data teams are there to help the organizations that they sit within to be more effective themselves. And those organizations, for the most part, a few exceptions obviously, don't exist to build data tooling. They exist to do something else. For us, it's to change the world of pet food for good. And so the time is to look outwards, go and change the world of pet food for good, go and reclaim self-serve. And that is why I think this is just the beginning. All of the investments and development that we've done in tooling over the last five years have, rather than being the end is not to get DBT out into your organization, the end is not your new BI platform, the end is not your data dictionary. These are the entry tickets. This is the foundation, and now the real work begins to go and empower the people around us. And that's it. If you want to find me on the socials, you can find me on GitHub below. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you want to get involved in the SQL Fluff project, we're at sqlfluff.com. If you want to get involved with tails.com, we're hiring. tails.com/careers is at the bottom. And as Erin said at the beginning, I will be around in the Slack to have a couple of good arguments with everyone here about self-serve. I can already see the memes rolling in. Yeah. Fire away.
Hello. I brought Barley to help close things out. Thank you so much for such a great presentation, Alan. I can tell that this is just the beginning of a lot of questions folks will have about some of the very visionary remarks that you made. I know we have a few minutes before we wrap, so I'm interested, like, do you feel like you've reclaimed self-service at Tails already? Or
No.
is that really the focus for your next year?
I think that's going to be the focus for next year. I think we've reclaimed analyst. I think we have, well, and I'd be curious for whether any of my team who are in the chat agree with this. I feel like we've reclaimed the desire for self-serve. I think there was a period in a lot of organizations a few years ago where I think data teams got burnt out around self-serve, but I think business users also got burnt out around self-serve. Like, it just, the tools were too complicated. It was too hard to get the insights you needed to. And I think we are, at least internally, starting to feel that resurgence of demand of people going, okay, I'm ready again now. I would like more capability. I'd like more tooling. I can see what you guys are doing, and this looks interesting and exciting. How do I get involved in that? How do I make small steps towards that without needing to get the whole thing? And I think that I think is what is the critical thing about what I think is different this time around. And maybe this maps quite nicely to the hype cycle, where there's, I'm going to forget the words. There's the digital hype, everyone thinks everything is amazing. And then there's the peak of like disappointment where you realize, actually, this isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all your problems in the first place. And I think we're now at the beginning of the second part, where self-serve never went away. It was still there, but the expectations are much more reasonable now, and people are wanting to get into this much more incrementally to take little pieces off and make progress with that. And I think that's going to be the foundation for actually useful self-serve, rather than spend all of your money on a BI tool that's going to solve all of your problems tomorrow.